My grandkids, my grown.
Oh, okay.
Lanterns are thought by some historians to be symbols for the Underground Railroad. So lanterns would be hung outside of windows. At least some historians are, they're not sure, but they're alleging that that may have been a possibility. That lanterns would be hung outside of windows to let people know that this house is a safe house, a station on the Underground Railroad. And in some cases, people have said, some people are alleged that quilting, African-American quilts were hung out to let people know. So there are all kinds of allegations. We're not sure if they're all true or not, but this monument points to some of them. So some of the symbols you see on there are symbols that have been found on many of the quilts, African-American quilts in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. And then, of course, the lantern here. So this is called the Gateway to Freedom exhibit. We know that Detroit was an important station on the Underground Railroad. Its code name was Midnight because you almost have freedom, almost at daybreak. Freedom is daybreak. So you're almost there. So its code name was Midnight. And flying geese stay on the drunkard's path and follow the stars. So sounds like nonsense. But basically what it's saying is, flying geese stay on the drunkard's path and follow the stars means you can't stay long here in Detroit. Slave catchers are around. You need to go to Canada because the slave catchers are around. So you got to stay on the path and follow the stars. The stars is north, North Star. You're going north, which sadly, I mean not sadly, but ironically, Canada's actually south of Detroit. But, oh, excuse me, you good. And then the monkey wrench turns the wagon wheel toward Canada on the Bear Paws Trail. And so you would say that, let's get out there picture. So, that's another statement basically saying you need to make it to Canada. Detroit is not safe right now.
The monkey wrench turns the wagon.
The monkey wrench turns the wagon wheel toward Canada on the Bear Paws Trail. Yeah. So it sounds like nonsense. Are you saying that nobody would think, nobody would know what the heck you're talking about? These are some of the people that's important. Let's talk about some of these people. So you got Reverend W. Anderson, Reverend S.D. Berry, Henry Bibb, who lived in Canada. This black man who would help black people who escaped from Detroit and made it to Canada, helped them organize in Canada their own self-sufficient communities. Also had a abolitionist newspaper. So that's Henry Bibb, Reverend Anthony Binga Jr., Reverend Anthony Binga Sr., Thornton, and Ruthie Blackburn. Ruthie changes her name after she's free to Lucy Blackburn. She didn't want to keep that slave name. So she changed her name to Lucy Blackburn. John Brown, we know he came to Detroit. John M. Brown, who I don't know. Reverend Supply Chase. Shoebell Conant, where Conant Gardens come from and the street Conant comes from. He was a Detroit alderman who was an abolitionist, white man who was an abolitionist, and refused to set up a racial restrictive covenant for his land that he owned, which means black people could live there. So that was one little small area of Detroit outside of Black Bottom that black people could live because
which brought Conant Gardens.
That's how Conant Gardens became a place. That's right. Shoebell Conant, Captain Thomas Chilver, Reverend Charles Davey, Reverend Samuel Davis, George the Baptiste. You know him. Alexander Duncan, Joseph Ferguson, Seymour Finney. We know his barn.
Yeah.
Reverend Foote, Mr. and Mrs. George French. We know Mrs. George French's real name is Caroline. She was one of the leaders of the freedom of Thornton and Ruthie Blackburn, the uprising in 1833. Daddy Grace, Shields Green, Horace Hatlock, Laura Haviland. Laura Haviland was in Adrian, Michigan based, and she started the first integrated school in Michigan. She started out as being a Quaker, but the Quakers were pacifists, and she couldn't deal with that. Her work on the Underground Railroad, she believed she had to be armed, so she left the Quaker church. Erastus Hussey ran the Underground Railroad spot in Battle Creek, Michigan, where the other monument is. That's Erastus Hussey and his wife Sarah. Reverend William King, Mr. and Mrs. William Lambert. I told you about William Lambert. His wife was, William Lambert's wife was George French's daughter. Okay. So Caroline and George French had a daughter that was married to William Lambert. Reverend Lent, Abram Lewis, Mr. and Mrs. Madison Lightfoot. We know Mrs. Madison Lightfoot, her name is Tabitha. She went with Caroline French to visit Ruthie Blackburn and walked out with her. Charles Monroe, that was the minister, the first minister at Second Baptist Church. Sleepy Polly drove the wagon. He was the person that John Cook paid for to drive the wagon to take Thornton and Ruthie Blackburn to the river. That's who that is, Sleepy Polly. Reverend William Troy, William Webb, Frederick Douglass and John Brown met at William Webb's house, Benjamin Willoughby. That first meeting of the 13 people was at Benjamin Willoughby's house. All right? So, George French home was the site. George French's home was the site of Second Baptist Church organizational meeting. That's Caroline French and George French's house. Second Baptist Church, the first one, is 1839 to 1854, it burned down. And then the second one is 1854 to 1857, and it expanded. Colored Methodist Society, Bethel AME Church is now on St. Antoine and Warren, but they started in the area we know as Black Bottom. And they also were an organization fighting against slavery and part of the Underground Railroad. St. Matthew's Protestant Episcopal Church is one of the churches that comes out of Second Baptist. The first minister of St. Matthew's is the first minister of Second Baptist. He would leave Second Baptist and become the pastor of St. Matthew's. We went to Finney Barnes site. The landing for ferry to Canada was at 2nd and Atwater. We didn't go there. The landing for the steamboat to Canada was at Griswold and Atwater. We almost are there. It's basically where the Princess is. That was a steamboat that took people over to Canada. The landing for ferry to Canada is at Randolph and Atwater. That's that way. George Baptiste home, we went there. William Webb home, we went there. The First Congregational Church of Detroit used to be down here. It is now on Woodward and Forest. And they have an Underground Railroad experience in their basement. So if you ever visit that, you can, it's a good sight to see. And this is one of the trails. The most important trail of the Underground Railroad going to Canada was this one. It's called the Michigan Central Trail. It's really an old Indian trail that black people followed. And now you know it is I-94. And that's it.
That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Woo! Jamon Jordan.
That's okay. Thank you so much.